Im Namen des Parlaments darf ich Sie ganz herzlich bei der heutigen Veranstaltung zum Thema feministische Außenpolitik begrüßen. Die Gastgeberin, die zweite Nationalratspräsidentin Doris Bures, kann leider heute nicht da sein. Wir sehen sie trotzdem gleich auf den Bildschirmen, weil sie bei einer COSAC-Konferenz, was das genau ist, wird sie dann gleich selbst erklären, in Spanien ist. Ganz kurz zu mir. Sie sehen meinen Namen, Markus Müller-Schienwald. Ich wurde eingeladen, freue mich sehr darüber, den heutigen Abend zu moderieren. Falls Sie sich für Außenpolitik interessieren, empfehle ich Ihnen das Ö1 Europajournal, jeden Freitag um 18:20 Uhr, gleich nach dem Abendjournal, das von mir gestaltet wird. Auch diesen Freitag wieder sehr interessant. Das Thema wird die OSZE-Präsidentschaft sein. Gut, so kurz die Schleichwerbung. Nationalratspräsidentin Doris Bures schickt herzliche Grüße aus Spanien. Wir werden sie in Kürze sehen. Ich möchte noch begrüßen die Gäste, die Botschafterin des Königreichs Spanien, Kristina Freie Jiménez de Muniana. Ich hoffe, das war jetzt ansatzweise richtig. Die ehemalige Präsidentin des Europäischen Parlaments, Ulrike Lunacek. Ganz herzlich willkommen. Ein besonderer Gruß geht auch an die anwesenden Mitglieder des Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, die das Programm heute zusammengestellt haben. Ich darf stellvertretend dafür die Präsidentin des VIDC, Nationalratsabgeordnete Gabriele Heinisch-Hossig, ganz herzlich begrüßen. Und die geschäftsführende Direktorin Sibylle Straubinger, die wir später am Abend noch hören werden. Begrüßen möchten wir natürlich die drei Gäste des heutigen Abends, die den eigentlichen Input, den Inhalt liefern werden, über den wir dann danach beim Empfang weiterreden können. Das sind Anne Linde, sie ist ehemalige Außenministerin des Königreichs Schwedens. Kristina Lunz, Mitbegründerin und Co-CEO des Center for Feminist Foreign Policy in Deutschland. Und Toni Haastrup, sie ist Chair in Global Politics an der Universität in Manchester. Auch Ihnen ganz herzlich willkommen. Und das Parlament war so nett, damit alles formell ganz in Ordnung ist, noch eine Liste anzufügen. Anschließend möchte ich noch begrüßen die aktiven und ehemaligen Abgeordneten zum Nationalrat. Sehe ich welche? Ehemalige. Zum Europäischen Parlament und Mitglieder des Bundesrates, die anwesenden Vertreterinnen und Vertreter des diplomatischen Korps und natürlich und vor allem Sie, die es hierher geschafft haben ins Parlament. Ganz kurz zum Ablauf des heutigen Abends. Die Begrüßung ist auf Deutsch, ein bisschen unhöflich unseren Gästen gegenüber, so the beginning and the end will be in German, so it's a little bit unpolite, aber wer meint, dass er dem deutschen oder später dem englischen Teil nicht folgen kann, es gibt eine Übersetzung. Also wenn Sie sich jetzt schon für den Diskussionsteil, der auf Englisch sein wird, vorbereiten wollen, dort hinten stehen die entsprechenden Ohrwascheln für die Übersetzung. Ich habe den Kanal 1 und 1 ist, wenn ich es richtig verstanden habe, Deutsch und 2 ist Englisch. Sie haben dann gegen Ende der Veranstaltung auch die Möglichkeit, selbst Fragen zu stellen, Anmerkungen zu machen, also vor allem Fragen zu stellen an die drei Vortragenden. Das kommt aber später und noch direkter können Sie dann reden, auch nachher beim Empfang. Gut, soweit der Beginn. Dann gehen wir gleich zum Einladungsstatement der stellvertretenden Nationalratspräsidentin Doris Bures. Ich darf um die Einspielung bitten.
Verehrten Damen und Herren, gerne wäre ich heute Abend in eurer Mitte, doch ich befinde mich gerade auf meinem Rückflug von Madrid nach Wien. In Madrid fand das Treffen der Europaausschüsse unter spanischen EU-Vorsitz statt. Das Kabinett von Pedro Sánchez hat zahlreiche frauenpolitische Erfolge in Spanien umgesetzt und auch seinen Ratsvorsitz dafür genützt, in Sachen Gewaltschutz europaweite Fortschritte zu erzielen. Ich erwähne das ganz besonders deshalb, weil das Thema Gewaltschutz gerade in Österreich aufgrund der schrecklich hohen Zahl an Femiziden ebenso ganz oben auf der Agenda stehen müsste. Liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, die Welt, in der wir leben, wird immer weniger friedlich. Alleine im Vorjahr sind über 230.000 Menschen in bewaffneten Konflikten gestorben. So viele wie seit 30 Jahren nicht mehr. Dass die Folgen bewaffneter Konflikte und der damit oft einhergehende Rückbau demokratischer Strukturen insbesondere Frauen trifft, brauche ich euch nicht zu sagen. Die Krisen der letzten Jahre, die internationalen politischen Spannungen und die neuen Kriegsgeschehnisse in Europa, Afrika und ganz aktuell auch im Nahen Osten machen einen Perspektivenwechsel in der Außenpolitik notwendig. Deshalb haben das VIDC und ich uns dazu entschlossen, zu Beginn der 16 Tage gegen Gewalt an Frauen auch die internationale Dimension zu beleuchten. Ich denke, die feministische Außenpolitik ist eine sinnvolle Herangehensweise und erlaubt relevante Impulse zur nachhaltigen Lösung und Prävention von Konflikten. Das Konzept der feministischen Außenpolitik ist nun seit etwa 10 Jahren in Europa in Diskussion. Ganz besonders dank der damaligen sozialdemokratischen Außenministerin Schwedens, Margot Wallström. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass eine ihrer Nachfolgerinnen, die ehemalige schwedische Außenministerin Linde, heute der Einladung gefolgt ist. Dear speakers, colleagues and friends, thank you discussing this important topic right here in Vienna. Vienna locates one of the 4 headquarters of the United Nations, the only one within the European Union. And so, Vienna has always been a place for international dialogue. Also, because Austria committed itself to a policy of active neutrality. Austria is always raising its voice for peace and human rights. And so I'm very happy welcoming all of you in the Austrian Parliament, the heart of our vital and liberal democracy. Thank you and welcome.
Vielen Dank an die zweite Nationalratspräsidentin. Wir wünschen ihr, dass sie einen besseren Flug hat. Linde ist ja im Schneechaos stecken geblieben beinahe. Gott sei Dank haben sie es noch rechtzeitig geschafft. Hoffentlich. Also in Spanien müssen wir nicht annehmen, dass es ein Schneechaos gibt. Worum es im heutigen Abend geht, das Programm wurde zusammengestellt vom VIDC und ich möchte Sibylle Straubinger, die geschäftsführende Direktorin des Instituts, nach vorne bitten, damit sie ein paar einleitende Worte sagen können.
Einen schönen guten Abend. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich Sie im Namen des VIDC heute begrüßen darf. Außenpolitik war bis vor kurzem eigentlich ein politisches Randthema und die Zeitungsartikel zu außenpolitischen Themen waren überschaubar. Das hat sich geändert in den letzten Jahren, würde ich sagen schon mal, aber vor allem auch in den letzten Monaten. Wir lesen, wir reden, wir diskutieren heute über Außenpolitik und gleichzeitig, ich nehme an, Ihnen geht es so wie mir auch oder vielen von Ihnen, gleichzeitig wird man dabei immer hoffnungsloser, weil kein Ende von Krisen, kein Ende der Gewalt auch in Sicht ist. So viele Staaten, die in ihrer Politik versagt haben und auch so viele internationale Organisationen, die handlungsunfähig sind, scheinen, dass es den Ruf und auch den Ruf eigentlich auch nach neuen Konzepten, nach neuen Ideen gibt. Eines der Konzepte ist feministische Außenpolitik und ich möchte mich bei der Gelegenheit sehr bedanken bei der zweiten Nationalratspräsidentin Doris Bures, dass es möglich ist, hier heute diese Veranstaltung zu machen und abzuhalten, nämlich hier im Parlament auch, weil wir da auch im Herzen der Demokratie sind. Es gibt eine Reihe von Gründen, warum das VIDC dieses Thema feministische Außenpolitik aufgegriffen hat. Ich möchte 2 ganz kurz nur herausgreifen. Das eine ist das Thema Gewalt gegen Frauen. Und wie Frau Präsidentin hat es schon erwähnt, wir sind mitten in den 16 Tagen gegen Gewalt. Und sie hat auch erwähnt, wie viele sozusagen in Kriegen jetzt ums Leben gekommen ist. Die UNO hat vor kurzem auch die Zahl bekannt gegeben der 2022 weltweit ermordeten Frauen und Mädchen. Und die ist auf dem höchsten Stand seit 20 Jahren. Über das Ausmaß von sexualisierter und sexueller Gewalt in Kriegen gibt es unzählige Berichte. Und gleichzeitig können Frauen viel seltener fliehen, egal ob das ist aufgrund von Kriegen, von Krisen, von Folgen des Klimawandels. Sie können es deshalb viel seltener, weil sie auch auf der Flucht mit Gewalt rechnen müssen. Der zweite Grund ist das Thema Frieden, ganz eng damit zusammenhängend, denn Frieden ist insbesondere für Frauen wichtig. Je gleichberechtigter Frauen in einem Staat sind, auch da gibt es genügend Untersuchungen dazu, desto niedriger ist die Gewaltbereitschaft des Staates. Friedensabkommen beispielsweise haben eine 35% höhere Wahrscheinlichkeit, dass sie gelingen, dass sie sozusagen lange auch erfolgreich sind, wenn Frauen sie mitgestalten. Wie Sie sich alle vorstellen können, sind trotzdem Frauen an den Verhandlungstischen kaum vorhanden. Die UNO-Resolution 1325, die zu Frauen, Frieden und Sicherheit im Jahr 2000 einstimmig im Sicherheitsrat der UNO verabschiedet wurde, beschäftigt sich genau mit diesen Aspekten. Und in Österreich gibt es seit 2007 einen nationalen Aktionsplan zur Umsetzung dieser Resolution. Ich erzähle das auch deshalb, weil das Thema feministische Außenpolitik nicht aus dem Nichts kommt, sondern da gibt es viele Erkenntnisse, da gibt es viele Studien, da gibt es auch Resolutionen zu eben diesen Themen, die in dieser feministischen Außenpolitik auch vereint sind und gebündelt sind. Schweden hat 2014 als erstes Land der Welt begonnen, seine Außenpolitik feministisch zu gestalten. Und es sind nicht wenige Staaten seitdem gefolgt, zuletzt Deutschland. In den deutschen Leitlinien steht, und auch das, glaube ich, ist nicht unwichtig zu betonen, feministische Außenpolitik ist keine Außenpolitik für Frauen, sondern für alle Mitglieder einer Gesellschaft. Sie schließt ein und nicht aus. Ja, eine feministische Außenpolitik will nicht nur Frauen und marginalisierte Gruppen stärker in Entscheidungen einbinden, sie will die Sicherheit dieser Gruppen ins Zentrum stellen, im Gegensatz zu einer herkömmlichen Außenpolitik, die die Sicherheit eines Staates und die Sicherheit der Grenzen im Fokus hat. Die heutige Veranstaltung oder mit der heutigen Veranstaltungen wollen wir diese Potenziale sichtbar machen. Wir wollen darüber diskutieren, wir wollen die Erfahrungen, aber auch die Herausforderungen, die mit der Umsetzung damit natürlich verbunden sind, auch diskutieren und anregen, über eine neue Ausrichtung von Außenpolitik auch nachzudenken, gerade in Zeiten auch von Kriegen und Konflikten, glaube ich, braucht es ein Umdenken. Und es wäre sehr schön zum Abschluss, wenn es gerade in diesen schwierigen und auch durchaus dunklen Zeiten gelänge, auch etwas Hoffnung zu entfachen, nämlich dass eine gerechtere und dass eine friedlichere Welt möglich ist damit. Vielen Dank und einen interessanten Abend.
Vielen Dank für die einleitenden Worte. Unter feministischer Außenpolitik können sich viele Menschen wenig vorstellen. Ich denke an ein Gespräch mit einem hohen Repräsentanten des Außenministeriums vor ein paar Jahren, der meinte, feministische Außenpolitik würden Sie doch ohnehin betreiben, denn wir würden alles in unserer Macht Stehende tun, damit mehr Frauen Botschafterinnen werden. Und das ist, glaube ich, ein guter Ansatz, aber es ist halt nur ein Teil von vielen. Was feministische Außenpolitik tatsächlich sein kann, umfasst sehr viele verschiedene Aspekte. Das VIDC war so nett, eine groben Übersicht zu liefern, der uns in einem kurzen Video präsentiert wird. Und da würde ich auch darum bitten, dass dieses Video jetzt zugespielt wird.
Wir leben in einer Zeit multipler Krisen. Die Welt steht vor Herausforderungen, die uns alle betreffen. Von globalen Konflikten und Kriegen über strukturelle Ungleichheit bis hin zur Klimakrise. Die internationalen Beziehungen sind komplexer und stärker miteinander verwoben denn je zuvor. In solchen Zeiten wird der Ruf nach neuen Ansätzen, wie wir diesen vielfältigen Herausforderungen begegnen können, immer lauter. Einer dieser Ansätze ist feministische Außenpolitik. Sie zeigt uns einen alternativen Weg, ein Umdenken, wie wir globalen Krisen begegnen. Aber was verbirgt sich hinter dem Begriff feministische Außenpolitik? Es existiert keine einheitliche Definition für feministische Außenpolitik und wie sie in der Praxis umgesetzt werden sollte. Grundsätzlich handelt es sich jedoch um eine Friedenspolitik, die eng mit den Menschenrechten verknüpft ist. Feministische Außenpolitik stellt Geschlechtergerechtigkeit als zentrale Voraussetzung für Frieden ins Zentrum. Sie legt den Fokus auf die Lebenssituation der am stärksten marginalisierten, also benachteiligten Gruppen und verfolgt daher einen intersektionalen Ansatz, um Sicherheit und Gleichberechtigung unter Menschen zu fördern. Darüber hinaus ist eine feministische Außenpolitik machtkritisch. Neben der Anerkennung bestehender Machtungleichheiten zwischen Geschlechtern strebt sie an, militarisierte und neokoloniale Gewaltstrukturen abzubauen. Grundsätzlich verfolgt eine feministische Außenpolitik also nicht nur eine Gleichstellung der Geschlechter, sondern fordert eine Transformation internationaler Machtverhältnisse. Schweden begann vor knapp 10 Jahren als erstes Land, seine Außenpolitik feministisch zu gestalten. Seit damals sind zahlreiche Regierungen weltweit diesem Beispiel gefolgt. Auch wenn die aktuelle konservative Regierung Schwedens sich inzwischen nicht mehr explizit zu diesem Ansatz bekennt. Länder wie Kanada, Norwegen, Mexiko, Spanien oder Deutschland arbeiten bzw. bekennen sich zu einer feministischen Außenpolitik. Und warum brauchen wir feministische Außenpolitik? Eine feministische Außenpolitik kann mit ihrem friedenspolitischen Ansatz dazu beitragen, weltweite Ungleichheiten zu verringern, um präventiv gegen globale Konflikte und Krisen vorzugehen. Bisher gibt es in keinem Land der Welt Geschlechtergerechtigkeit. Untersuchungen haben allerdings ergeben, dass je gleichberechtigter Frauen in einem Staat sind, umso niedriger ist die Gewaltbereitschaft des Staates. Auch die Wahrscheinlichkeit für den anhaltenden Erfolg von Friedensabkommen steigt um 35%, wenn Frauen daran beteiligt sind. Aber weniger als 10% der Verhandlungsführenden und nur 3% der Unterzeichnenden sind Frauen. Und lediglich in 25 von 1500 Friedensverträgen, die zwischen 2000 und 2016 geschlossen wurden, werden Frauen explizit erwähnt. Dabei sind gerade Frauen meist besonders stark von Krisen und Kriegen betroffen. In einer Welt voll multipler Krisen, globaler Herausforderungen und immer extremeren Ungleichheiten will feministische Außenpolitik Wege zu gerechteren Lösungen aufzeigen.
Soweit der theoretische Oberbau und jetzt kommen wir in die Praxis. Wir haben die große Freude, mit Anna Linde, eine der Proponentinnen der feministischen Außenpolitik des Landes, hier zu haben, die diesen Begriff, ich möchte fast sagen, erfunden hat und auch mitgeprägt hat. Ich würde Sie auf die Bühne bitten, damit Sie uns in einem kurzen Statement erklären, was das Besondere an der feministischen Außenpolitik in Schweden war und an diesem Punkt auch gleich der Sprachwechsel, also alle, die noch keine aufhaben, müssen sich jetzt aufsetzen oder absetzen, wenn sie sie aufhatten, denn wir wechseln jetzt auf Englisch. Frau Außenministerin, darf ich Sie aufs Podium bitten? So.
Thank you very much. Have you got your ears on? Most understand English, I guess. Well, it's true, like they said on both the film and the speech, that we are actually living in a time of crisis. It's more than 1.5 years since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and there is no peace in sight. 2 years has now passed since the Taliban took control in Afghanistan, and the situation for women and girls are horrific. The brave women in Iran are still protesting a misogynist regime. Many of them are paying a heavy price with prison, tortures, and even death. And the devastating war between Hamas and Israel after the horrendous terrorist attack by Hamas, and also the response from Israel that is affecting many, many civilians, not least children and women, is a terrifying way of showing the world we are in now. It's a world of crisis. And we also have with COP28, is it? 28, started today. It puts the light on the climate and environmental crisis, and that's threatening our planet and its inhabitants, and disproportionately is affecting women and girls. When half of the population still does not enjoy the same rights, representation, and resources as the other half, there is a need to adopt a gender lens to foreign policy. In my experience, after nearly 7 years as Minister for Trade, Minister for EU Affairs, and Minister for Foreign Affairs, such a lens transforms our view of the world. I have witnessed firsthand the importance of this agenda on the ground in many conflict areas, including Ukraine and the Caucasus. Common to all those conflicts and crises are that women and girls and marginalized individuals, due to historical and structural inequalities, are hit the hardest. Gender equality is a fundamental prerequisite to achieve all foreign policy goals: sustainable peace, security, and the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals cannot be achieved if we exclude half of the world's population, and many more agree on the importance of applying a systematic gender perspective to foreign policy. In 2014, Sweden became the first country in the world to declare a feminist foreign policy and establish a new standard that several countries now have followed. Around 15 countries currently pursue a feminist foreign policy. And many more agrees on the importance of applying a systematic gender perspective to foreign policy. One of the most important things with pursuing a feminist foreign policy is the fact that you do it systematically. It's not just a gender ad hoc thing that you need to remember. A feminist approach is not only about perspective, it's a way of analyzing and developing policy and operational responses to the challenges we face today. It contributes to sustainable and peaceful development and future, and it helps us to become a counterbalance to the actors pushing back against gender equality in different contexts and arenas. A tool that we developed and used are the 3 R's: rights, representation, and resources. Rights. The simple fact is that human rights are also women's rights. Here, 2 fundamental tracks must be followed when pursuing a feminist foreign policy. Firstly, there are areas where we must aim for prohibition, such as gender-based discrimination, forced marriages, and female genital mutilation. Secondly, there are areas where we need to aim for progress, for example, equal rights to inheritance, access to education and health, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. These areas are key to women's empowerment. Representation. All individuals must have the same right to participation, education, and influence in decision-making processes. Women are chronically underrepresented at key forums where decisions are made. This goes for all areas, be it peace negotiation, company boards, or political parties. Resources. Resources need to be allocated to promote equal opportunities. This means that we should identify and promote targeted measures. For example, strengthening gender mainstreaming of grants management and pursue diversity-responsive budgeting. 2 concrete examples on how Sweden systematically applied the feminist foreign policy is during our time in the UN Security Council in 2017 and 18. And where we, as a country, and me personally, were chairperson in office in the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, OSCE, in 2021. In United Nations Security Council, we consistently sought to ensure that the Council included a focus on women, peace and security in all discussions and decisions. We pushed for the Council to be briefed by civil society representative, for women, peace and security to be discussed in each and every country file, and we showed that it was indeed possible to achieve gender balance among those briefing the Council during Sweden's presidency in July 2018. And I'm happy to see that several countries have followed us in this regard. As chairperson in the office of OSCE, I in a similar way sought to integrate women, peace and security in all dimensions. I brought the situation for women and girls in all my meetings, and I consulted with women organizations in every visit in the region, including in Central Asia, Russia and Ukraine. The OSCE special envoys to conflicts were asked to especially look at how to increase women's participation in peace processes. I appointed a special representative for gender and an advisory group on gender to advise OSCE. And the fact is that the 15 missions of OSCE, 14 were led by men and 1 by a woman. And now we have had the first academic evaluation of a feminist foreign policy. The University of Gothenburg has put a very adequate headline: more than a label, less than a revolution. The main conclusion is that the implementation of feminist foreign policy consisted of much more than simply relabeling existing gender equality activities as feminist, but the implementation was uneven and incomplete. Overall, there was a marked increase in gender equality work among foreign policy agencies and aid and embassies after the feminist foreign policy was launched. There was also marked variation in how the feminist foreign policy was implemented. The researchers and writers of the evaluation says that the feminist foreign policy, being just a label or poster politics, is fundamentally wrong. After a systematic review of what feminist foreign policy meant in practice for the bilateral work in the Foreign Service, they concluded that feminism was never just a label. The feminist foreign policy led to a concrete effort, a concerted effort, with more gender equality and more gender equality initiatives and a number of new initiatives in all areas of foreign policy: foreign trade, international development cooperation, and security policy. They also pointed to the fact that there are a perception that the withdrawal of feminist foreign policy means that Sweden's gender equality work will come to a complete halt. But this is yet another misunderstanding. The government's withdrawal of feminist foreign policy does not mean that Sweden can stop working on international gender equality issues. On the contrary, Sweden has a far-reaching commitments in this area and had undertaken various ways to continue its international gender equality work. And this is what we will hold the new government accountable for. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot for your first presentation. The next speaker on the podium is Mrs. Kristina Lunz. She's the co-founder and co-CEO of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, co-founded in 2018. She's a long list of achievements and positions, advisory group of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Goalkeepers Initiative, working for the UNDP in several countries, but most relevant to most of you is, and most tangible, she has written the bestseller, The Future of Foreign Policy is Feminist, at Ullstein Verlag, that you can, maybe you still need someone. We discussed that we would talk about Christmas presents. Maybe you have someone who would need this book as a Christmas. Ms. Lunz, please be so kind to share your thoughts for about 5 minutes.
ganz herzlich lieben Dank. Nachdem Linde schon den ganzen Rundumschlag gemacht hat und das Video auch so exzellent war, dachte ich mir so, ja, was machen denn Toni und ich dann noch hier? Aber wir versuchen das mal, weil das Wunderbare heute Abend ist ja, dass dieses Panel wirklich, ich finde es wirklich besonders, weil wir haben 3 sehr unterschiedliche Perspektiven. Wir haben eben eine ehemalige Außenministerin, dann Toni, Akademia und dann noch feministischer Aktivismus, Zivilgesellschaft. Und ich glaube, da haben wir doch einiges zu ergänzen. Und vor dem Verständnis, dass mein Fokus auch die feministische Zivilgesellschaft ist, möchte ich noch mal einen Schritt zurücknehmen. Es ist ganz richtig, dass Schweden 2014 das erste Land war, das weltweit eine feministische Außenpolitik verkündet hatte und damit auch implementiert hatte und andere Länder dem gefolgt sind. Und gleichzeitig ist auch wahr, dass Schweden und Margot Wallström damals das nur machen konnten, weil seit Jahrzehnten davor feministische Zivilgesellschaft schon wahnsinnige wichtige Vorarbeit gemacht hat. Und darauf möchte ich mich kurz konzentrieren. Davor gehe ich noch einen Schritt zurück. Wir alle nicht persönlich, aber die Menschheit lebt seit 4.000 bis 6.000 Jahren in einer patriarchalen Gesellschaft. Das ist ziemlich lange. Und eine patriarchale Gesellschaft, das bedeutet, dass es diese Vormachtstellung gibt von Männern im Staat und in der Familie. Und um eine Vormachtstellung aufrechtzuerhalten, braucht es Hierarchien in der Gesellschaft. Und Hierarchien gegenüber Frauen, gegenüber Männern, die nicht männlich genug sind und dann nochmal gegenüber Frauen mit Behinderung. Und all diese unterschiedlichen Hierarchien müssen aufrechterhalten werden durch Gewaltanwendung. So ist das, dass wir wahnsinnig irrsinnige Zahlen weltweit haben von beispielsweise männlicher Gewalt gegen Frauen. Am Wochenende erst haben wir am 25. November den Tag zur Beendigung von männlicher Gewalt gegen Frauen gefeiert, weil, wie es gerade erwähnt wurde, die Vereinten Nationen, also nicht nur deshalb, aber deshalb ist es immer wieder wichtig, weil die Vereinten Nationen vergangene Woche erst bekannt gegeben haben, dass im letzten Jahr 89.000 Mädchen, Frauen und Mädchen getötet wurden aufgrund ihres Geschlechtes. Das ist der höchste Wert seit 20 Jahren. Und die Gewalt gegen Frauen ist so allgegenwärtig, die männliche Gewalt gegen Frauen, dass wir das gar nicht mehr so als Problem wahrnehmen. Wir nehmen es nicht als Problem wahr, dass in Deutschland jeden Tag ein Mann versucht, seine Partnerin oder Ex-Partnerin zu töten und dass ihm auch jeden 3. Tag gelingt. Oder dass in Deutschland alle 4 Minuten eine Frau von ihrem Partner oder Ex-Partner eine Form von Gewalt wie psychischer, mentaler oder physischer Gewalt erfährt. Das ist so einfach dieser Ozean am Ende, in dem wir schwimmen. Und diese Gewalt gegen Frauen oder auch rassifizierte Gewalt gegenüber die LGBTQI-Community, das sind diese Gewaltformen, die diese Hierarchien für die Vormachtstellung von Männern in Staat und der Familie seit Tausenden von Jahren aufrechterhalten, bis heute. FeministInnen vor 250 Jahren haben dann angefangen, wirklich sich zu organisieren und in Bewegungen dagegen vorzugehen. Die feministische Bewegung ist bis heute die erfolgreichste darin, gesellschaftlichen Wandel zu schaffen und das mit friedlichen Mitteln zum Großteil. Die feministische Bewegung, unter anderem ausgehend von der Bewegung um die Suffragetten herum, hatten sich 1915 in Den Haag getroffen. 1915 während des Ersten Weltkrieges. Und die kamen zusammen, mehr als 1200 FeministInnen, Frauen, um nicht nur ein Ende zu fordern des Ersten Weltkrieges, sondern sie stellten 20 Resolutionen auf für eine Vision für eine gerechtere globale Ordnung. Und diese Resolutionen beinhalteten unterschiedliche Ideen, wie beispielsweise damals total revolutionär die Idee, dass Frauen das Wahlrecht haben sollte. Die Idee, dass es eine internationale Organisation geben sollte, in der internationale Streitigkeiten beigelegt werden sollten oder eine Organisation, in der wirtschaftliche Streitigkeiten beigelegt werden sollen. Oder auch ein Ende des militärindustriellen Komplexes, weil die Frauen, die Feministinnen damals eben schon sagten, Leute, wir werden kein Ende von internationalen Kriegen und Konflikten sehen, solange die Produktion von Waffen und die Ausführung von Kriegen derart rentabel für so viele Menschen ist. So wird es kein Ende von Kriegen geben. Und diese Feministinnen, die damals zu einem Großteil nicht ernst genommen wurden. Also sie haben damals den Papst besucht und ehemaligen US-Präsident Wilson und andere Staatschefen und kaum jemand hat sie ernst genommen. Was wir aber dann gesehen haben über die nächsten ca. 70, 80 Jahre, dass die meisten, fast alle der 20 Resolutionen irgendwie in Realität umgesetzt wurden, bis auf eine der wichtigsten, und zwar die Abschaffung des militär-industriellen Komplexes, also Disarmament, Demilitarisierung und ein Ende von der Militarisierung von auch Sicherheitsstrukturen. Und warum ist das so wichtig? Und auch in dem tollen Film kam das natürlich auf. Und warum ist das? Ganz oft fragen Leute, aber warum? Was hat denn jetzt Demilitarisierung und nukleare Abrüstung und tödliche autonome Waffensysteme und Klein- und Langarmwaffen und Weapons of Mass Destruction, was haben die denn eigentlich mit Feminismus zu tun? Alles, weil Feminismus, dabei ging es ja schon immer darum, männliche, gewaltvolle Strukturen zu beenden, in der Hoffnung, dass endlich alle Menschen in Frieden, Sicherheit und Freiheit leben können. Und deswegen fokussiert sich die feministische Bewegung auch in der Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik auf die Demilitarisierung. Und die nach 1915 mit dann der Gründung einer der wichtigsten Organisationen in dem Bereich der Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, über die Jahrzehnte hat es ganz viele wichtige Entwicklungen gegeben, was Militarisierung angeht, aber was auch in den 70er Jahren beispielsweise die Dekade für die Frauen von der UN, die UN-Frauendekade angeht, mit wichtigen Konferenzen in Mexiko-Stadt und Nairobi und Kopenhagen. Und daraus weiterentwickelt hat sich dann beispielsweise die bereits erwähnte Resolution 1325 zum Frauenfrieden und Sicherheit im Sicherheitsrat der Vereinten Nationen. Und auf all dem aufbauend konnte dann, und das war ein sehr, sehr mutiger Schritt damals, weil es ganz viel Auslachen und Delegitimierungsversuche gab. Damals konnte dann Schweden eine feministische Außenpolitik verkünden und das war sehr, sehr wichtig. Das war wichtig für Zivilgesellschaft, also wechselwirkend. Für Zivilgesellschaft war es wichtig, dass Staaten das machen, weil damit einhergehend auch mehr Bereitstellung von Geldern beispielsweise folgte. Nicht alles perfekt, aber so folgte das auch. Und andersrum, die Zivilgesellschaft wirklich ist für feministische Außenpolitik weltweit einer der zentralen Punkte, nach dem man sich orientieren sollte im außenpolitischen Vorgehen. Und das ist so ein bisschen die Vorgeschichte aus der zivilgesellschaftlichen Perspektive. Und feministische Außenpolitik, und der Film hat das wirklich sehr gut gezeigt, ist dieser Versuch, basierend auf diesem reichen Erbe an feministischem Denken, Handeln, Praktizieren, Aktivismus über Jahrzehnte und Jahrhunderte, darauf nun jetzt eine nachhaltige, neue globale Ordnung zu entwickeln, sodass langfristiger Frieden und Stabilität wirklich möglich ist. Denn am Ende wird das nur möglich sein, wenn patriarchale Strukturen weltweit abgeschafft, abgebaut, zerstört werden. Und die Abschaffung patriarchaler Strukturen, das ist Feminismus. Das heißt, dass ohne Feminismus kann es keinen nachhaltigen Frieden geben. Danke.
Vielen Dank. Was wir aus diesen Inputs für die Zivilgesellschaft hier in Österreich machen können, werden wir später noch diskutieren, bevor wir wieder nach Österreich zurückkommen. And we again mixed with the languages. Before we come back to Austria, we are going to the global south. And I'm happy to invite Toni Haastrup to give us a 5-minute presentation. Toni Haastrup is Chair of Global Politics at the University of Manchester since September of this year. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh, awarded with a lot of prizes. We are impressed. You can read it in her CV. And she's working on feminist policies in the global south. So please, the floor is yours. 5 minutes.
Thank you. I know you've been promised the academic perspective, but I promise I'm not going to lecture you, but rather share some of my thinking around feminist foreign policy. So what we academics do is we produce knowledge, and a lot of the knowledge production on feminist foreign policy is very much dominated by what it is that the global north or the west does And in that context, often the Global South is cast in this role of supporting characters by virtue of being recipients of these policies. From my perspective, it is especially curious that many feminist foreign policies tend to focus on the Global South, even though regular foreign policy looks at everyone. Of course, I should say feminist foreign policy is not just about the Global South, but that relationship is curious. In this context, it's worth taking a step back to explore the architecture within which feminist foreign policy has developed over the last decade. There, of course, remains the persistence of global power hierarchies, as has been demonstrated by the previous speakers. And a lot of these power hierarchies are steeped in colonial logics. As such, myself and other African feminists have argued that the practice of feminist foreign policy, in order to do better than foreign policy, within the current state system, must go beyond reproducing commitments that already align with the status quo. Feminist foreign policy, of course, must be people-centered. It should examine implications of continued land appropriation, exploitation of labor, control of natural resources within the international system. It should focus on state institutions and the ways in which they're able to foster feminist peace. It should look at issues around the status and control of gender and sexuality. Often, we assume that these issues are not of concern to those in the Global South. Yet, Global South feminist alternatives demand a deep interrogation of historic structures and relations between the Global North and the Global South, paying attention, of course, to some of these issues, but also paying attention to and integrating the priorities of the global majority. Feminist movements in the Global South want to move us towards a more emancipatory model of the world, as we saw in the previous video. So we see this new feminist impetus in foreign policy discourse and practice as signaling an opportunity to hold power to account. Discussions on feminist foreign policy provide the opportunity for Global South feminists to critique harmful racist, colonial, authoritarian, and masculinized power in the overall effort to attain gender justice wherever they may occur. The importance of Global South feminists is considered in acknowledging some of the new iterations of feminist foreign policy. And we especially see this in the acknowledgement, for example, within Germany's development policy, although a lot of colleagues know with disappointment that the defense is not so robust in the general guidelines. Nevertheless, even within those guidelines, intersectionality features. Intersectionality, of course, refers to acknowledging structures of oppression and discrimination and thinking about the ways in which they interact with each other to often traumatize the most vulnerable in the world. And in applying intersectionality to a foreign policy lens, the focus then shouldn't really be on fixing those who are minoritized within the international system, but rather thinking through the ways in which powerful actors are implicated in this variety of traumas. To do much, of course, political will and the willingness, I think, to be uncomfortable are necessary prerequisites for feminist ideas like intersectionality, but others, to make more sense in a feminist foreign policy context. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So may I invite you on the stage while you are on your way? I think when it comes to feminist politics and feminist foreign policy, it is important to break it down. And you brought a very nice example. You were stuck in the snowstorm in Stockholm on the way here. Unfortunately, we don't have snow here yet. Let's see. And you brought the example of feminist snow cleaning, which means, and it sounds very banal, that the part of the road that is used by women should be cleaned first, which is not happening, because we all know in Vienna and everywhere in Austria, what is clean first are the roads, and who is sitting in the cars that use the roads well. You have your image in your head. And then you brought another example. We introduced you as Minister of Foreign Affairs, but before you have been Minister of Trade. Is there a kind of, and trade politics is of course part of foreign policy, in countries like Austria that is so highly dependent on foreign trade, should know this. So is there a kind of feminist approach in trade politics?
Well, thank you, and I'm happy that you you mentioned the feminist snow cleaning, because first people were mocking about that, but that's for real. So now Stockholm has a feminist snow cleaning, and I think that's very, very good. Yes, when I was Minister of Trade, then we saw what is the feminist trade policy. And the first thing we said was, well, we need to see if there are any differences between how men and women are affected by trade. And it was very difficult to find disintegrated statistics. And it shows that more than 300 million women are not seen in the statistic, because you haven't said this is for men and this is for women. So, but finally we found the tariffs for United States, because inside EU, you know, we don't have tariffs. And what we found was that a silk blouse that is exported has 6 times as high tariff as a man's shirt. And when you look at sportswear, like tank tops and sports trousers and sneakers, there's a 30% higher tariff on women's sportswear than on men's sportswear, and with no explanation. Because they know they can take more money from women's clothes and so on. And that's a very typical thing that we need then in negotiation for trade diplomats or trade negotiator, to show, is there a difference between tariffs for women and men? And we also saw, for example, that when it comes to trade, you have all those standards. And we found out that there was a 47% higher risk for women to have an injury in a car crash. And we said, has that something to do with standards? And we asked our authorities and so on. Yes, it has, because the standard for safety belt was done with a male length and weight, so that the safety belts were not as safe for women as for men. And that means that when you are negotiating standards, you have also to have a feminist perspective on it. So in issue after issue, if you put your feminist lens on, you see it. And if you don't, you just don't notice it. So that's why I think it's very, very important to always put your gender lens on when you're doing it. And we managed, for the first time ever, when I was trade minister, in the World WTO, World Trade Organization, to have a resolution on women and trade, and also a toolbox for trade negotiators to have a gender analysis of trade agreements. So it is absolutely possible. Otherwise, people think trade, that's so typically male. No, it's not.
Well, I brought this example to show we have to break things down. You mentioned labeling alone is wrong. I wanted to make 2 rounds here on the stage and then move on to you in the auditorium. And at the beginning, I would like to play sort of Advocatus Diaboli, and start with a very, very not abstract example. So all of you mentioned the Russian aggression against Ukraine. This spring there was a conference in the European Parliament where Russian opposition members assembled, majority of course male. And there was kind of an uproar because one of these guys, a credible liberal politician, I met him several times, so he's one of the good guys, if you want to have it that way. One of them said on the stage, first we have to get rid of Putin, and then we can talk about women and LGBT and other small issues. But first we have to get rid of Putin. So what would be your reply to this, Mr. Alexashenko?
Well, let me say one thing that is, I think it's very typical. In 2014, I was State Secretary for Home Affairs. And I went to meet after the accession of Crimea to meet the State Secretary of Home Affairs in Ukraine, because we wanted also the Pride Parade to get security from the police and so on. And she told me, don't you understand, we cannot deal with things like LGBT and pride parades when we have a Crimea annexation. We need to concentrate on that. And then I told her, it's now when Russia are annexation the Crimea and actually are threatening your liberal values and your values of freedom of everybody who want to be. Now it's the time that you should defend the right to Pride Parade, the right to feminism. Is exactly now when you are threatened by a dictatorship, by an authoritarian regime. Now is when you should do that. And it's not because of what I say, but actually the next year the police was supporting the Pride Parade and make it more secure for them. So I would say to them, it's the opposite. It's when you're under attack that you should stand up for our rights and freedoms.
Well, I brought this example not to blame Mr. Alexashenko, who is, by the way, a very credible person, but because it is very typical. So what would be your argument that you would tell someone, you have this discussion in Germany, no, first we have to think of tanks and then we can think of women's rights?
In German or in English? German or in English?
I think we can stay in English on the stage, if that's okay with you.
So this happens all the time. There are so many people out there interested in preserving the patriarchal status quo, so all sorts of arguments are brought in to delegitimize new ideas, new ways of thinking. So, for example, in March last year, a month after not only the beginning of the full-scale invasion by Putin, but also a month after the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced the Zeitenwende, the turning point, and kind of the special fund for the German armed forces was when the current main opposition leader, when he stood in parliament and when he said, you know what, you can do your feminist foreign policy and your feminist international assistance, you can do all of that, but not with the money for the German Bundeswehr, for the German army. And he kept saying these things with his argument being, we don't have money for such things. We have to focus on the proper stuff. We have to focus on hard security. That comes all the time, and that is okay that people keep saying that, because these people maybe might be intellectually lazy and might be very used to the status quo and not willing to think outside the box. First of all, as I try to outline in my little speech before, one of the key moments of feminist foreign policy was during the First World War. So in time of war, and feminism has always been about hard security, about addressing male violence. So it's just like one of these derailing strategies that we as feminists, we've been used to like forever since we've been doing our work. So it's nothing for me personally to take seriously. And then with the example about Putin and the speech that you just mentioned, it's just, again, very short-sighted because, and I'm trying to outline it in my book on the chapter of feminist foreign policy in times of war and conflict. I have a sub-chapter on Ukraine and Russia. But also, and here's maybe the first book recommendation of the evening, there's this excellent book by a German foreign policy expert called Sabine Fischer. It's called Russlands Chauvinismus. And it's on Russian foreign policy, from a feminist angle. And what we've seen in Russia, especially since 2000, since Putin gained power, there was this like continuous destruction and dismantling of women's rights, LGBTQI rights. It was part of this whole narrative of alienating Gay-Europa, Europe from Russia, and it's part of all his policy making. And feminists and human rights defenders in Russia, for years, they have been warning that this might be the precursor of something worse to come. So if someone says we don't have time for this now because we have to focus on getting rid of Putin, this person might not see the full context of that Putin's work is especially grounded in anti-feminist, anti-human rights rhetoric. And this rhetoric has been the base of all his work. One example being 2016, I think, when intimate partner violence was again legalized in Russia. And you have these so many examples coming from Russia.
I'll make a very illicit recommendation. All of you who are permanent listeners of the Europa Journal, of course, know this book by Sabine Fischer because she has been in my show like a month ago when the book was published. So a huge recommendation for this book. Again, if you need something for distant relatives, for Christmas holiday, yes, this is it. You can have everything in one go, feminist politics, pro-Putinism, everything. All the arguments you need are in this book. Very esteemed colleague Sabine Fischer. Well, to come back to, not tonight, well, what we have seen in Ukraine is the first time since the 90s, the return of sexual violence as a means of war. When you look at Africa, this has been happening there for a long time. Why didn't we see this here in the West?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think that question is for all of us here, really. Why don't we see that in the West? And it sort of goes to the heart of the ways in which psychologically we prioritize what is important. And I think, indeed, when we think about what's going on in places now, like in the Sudan, the fact that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 7 million people are displaced, the fact that women in the Tigray region in Ethiopia continue to experience both intimate partner violence, but also the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. It's something that African feminists are very concerned about. It's something that African feminists often bind together to work on without any sort of substantive support, not from states and not from external actors. I think one of the things that has been interesting to watch, as somebody who's also really interested in European Union foreign policy in Africa, is the ways in which priorities shift in times of crisis. And I think this is one of the things that all three of us have said, that, you know, it's precisely in the time of crisis that you should really stick to not just what your values are, but what the priorities are. When we think, for example, that since the shift from the African Peace Facility to the European Peace Facility, the majority of the funding there has gone just towards the Ukraine war. And the fact is, there are finite resources. I don't think, I think, you know, a lot of this money is European taxpayers, and there's only so much that you can get from it. And if there are finite resources and you've committed them to one conflict, it's not that that conflict is any less important or we shouldn't provide support for it. It means that in other areas, it will suffer. But I also think that, you know, we cannot discount the role of the media and what is considered relevant and what is considered sexy, so to speak. And I think what feminist foreign policy allows us to do, what the feminist lens allows us to do, is to interrogate the different ways in which power manifests itself, whether it's in terms of how the media reports it, whether it's in terms of what type of conflict, for example, is prioritized, or whether it's in terms of what precise policy area within feminist foreign policy will get attention. And I think, again, crisis is a real it's the time to really test the resilience of feminist foreign policies.
Well, we are located in the Houses of Parliament, and in January, in the Committee of Defense, here there will be a discussion about the new Austrian national security strategy. Don't worry if you have never heard about this. The discussion has been going on since April, and it has been hidden in plain sight. My impression is with purpose by interesting enough, this is going to take place in the Committee of Defense. Germany has just published a new, after several years, if I'm not mistaken, almost 3 years of deliberation, your new national security strategy, which is influenced very heavily by thoughts of by feminist approach. What would you recommend MPs, civil society here in Austria, to bring feminist perspectives into this new national security strategy that is in the working as we speak?
Well, I wish it was heavily influenced by feminist thinking. It's not the case. Unfortunately, we see that we have the guidelines on feminist foreign policy in Germany, and then we have the national security strategy. And when the national security strategy a few months ago was published, we were hoping that it would really take on the feminist approaches as well. So especially when there was this event and the speech by Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock at the kind of at the kickoff for the national security strategy, in her speech, the speech was really good, and we were hoping that because of that, it might influence feminist thinking, the strategy then, because there was a focus on human security and prevention and like a wider concept of security, not the traditional militarized security, but what you also mentioned before, or in the journalist meeting, I don't remember, and like about food security, and it's about having being able to pay for rent and like the human security understanding of security. I wish the strategy was more influenced in the alignment between the guidelines on feminist foreign policy and the national security strategy were stronger. In any case, though, what can be recommended for a process in other countries, I would say, is to like really strongly include feminist civil society, human rights defenders, women human rights defenders in the process, pay them for their work, because especially civil society does not have work, so pay them when you get the advice. You would always... That's really a funny thing, right? Like governments, for example, when they get consultants in from the big consultancy firms, they pay them thousands of euros. But when you ask for advice from civil society, they're expected to do it for free. When we as civil society barely have any financial security in what we're doing. So pay them, get them in, women human rights defenders, feminist civil society, from, of course, within the country, but also from all those aspects and countries and regions and areas where your foreign policy and national and parts of the national security strategy, which is foreign policy, where it has an impact on.
So you have been on the other side of the aisle, to put it this way. What would be your advice to your fellow, well, if you were still in the shoes of the foreign ministry, what would be your advice to your colleagues here in Austria? Why it is important and how could they include feminist approaches in our new national security strategy?
Well, I think it's very, very important to have the women, peace and security aspects in all different ways, and that you always ask for a gender analysis of every mission. As one example, there is a Nordic center for gender in military missions placed in Stockholm, but is NATO certified. And that goes very, very thoroughly through how do you see to that there is a gender analysis when you have a mission. And I can take you one example. I asked all those head of missions in OSCE to have a gender analysis, and we have the yearly meeting of military advisors on this specific center, and all of those military advisors are men. There are no women, and they thought it was stupid because why should we have this? It has nothing to do with real security. And then for 3 days they came to this center of gender in military operation, and they saw that this is actually something that we need to have. I can take 2 examples. One is that, and that's from Africa. And it was told by my former colleague in the government, who was deputy head of UN Women, who went to one of the conflicts in Africa, and they had not made, where there was foreign missions, they had not made a gender analysis, so they had not put specifically soldiers to secure the areas where the women went, for example, to get water in the fountains. And of course, the rebels went to the fountains where the women took their water, and it was totally unprotected. So they raped the women, but not enough. They didn't only rape the women, they cut one ear off the women after a rape. So when the woman came back to the village, she was, dismissed. This is what happened. You have heard about Yazidi women. It's kind of the same story, that you use the women to take down the resistance among the population that you try to conquer. And if you don't have a gender analysis, you don't see this even. And the second thing is another issue where you have camps and you want people to get into it, they have to be body searched. And they didn't do a gender analysis. They only had men who stand in the security, and then they came women who wanted to leave important messages to the military inside the camp. But they should be body searched by foreign men. That was, of course, not possible. And it created a lot of disruption and even violence and everything, because they had not done a gender analysis. So I think to put this into any national strategy, that for each mission that you send Austrian soldiers to, there need to be gender analysis. And for everything you need to have a women, peace and security. And for everything that you should ask accountability for, you should include sexual and gender-based violence. So there is many issues that you can take up that is hardcore security that fits very well into a national security strategy.
Mm-hmm. That's something that maybe if we have some advisors of MPs here, they can take it to their MPs who will discuss it. So I would like to open the floor, and there are a lot of questions. I'll try to group it. So the first 2 have been over there. I will take 3 questions in a row. So first is here, second is over there, and the third is again here. Please, could you be so kind to stand up? Very briefly introduce yourself and ask a question. So we of course we are running out of time. We are always running out of time. So please keine Co-Referate. So please a question. So very welcome.
Okay, my name is Hans. I'm from Sweden. I also worked in Africa for UNICEF as Child Protection Officer. I have this question, why you're gliding on concept. You're talking about feminist and you're talking about gender. Not of this discussion is talked about the actual instrument, which is the CEDAW Convention from 1979, CEDAW, which is about women's rights. Why are we talking about gender and feminism, which is unlegal legislated concepts that doesn't really have a clear meaning? Except for perhaps if you're sitting in certain groups. But in order to keep a country legally obliged to do things, you would really have to stick to the instrument. So what I'm missing here is not the feminist analysis, but the human rights analysis. And if you do that on different countries, the outcome might be different. We have 9 human rights instruments. One is about handicapped, one is about women, one is about children, one is about migrant workers. It's not for sure that in all cases women is coming out on top. If I'm in my home country, Sweden, I wouldn't want to be, I would rather be a woman than I would be a Muslim person in my country. I would think I would suffer more discrimination in the later case. So just wonder why you're avoiding the legal framework that actually already exists. Why are you watering that down?
Thanks. The second question is the gentleman over here, dark hair with the glasses.
You should have every second a woman.
Next is... Yeah. This was because of the distribution of microphones in the room. The second... Okay.
I can wait.
So... We have the second question, so the second raised arm was also in this quarter. I think it was you with the...
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you. Alexandra Dienes, I'm the co-president of Women in International Security Austria, and in my day job I work for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Thanks so much to the podium, to the panel. Toni, I have a question to you, since you mentioned that the Global South countries are often on the receiving end of feminist foreign policy. Whether perhaps you could give us a few examples, some success stories maybe of feminist foreign policies in some countries of the Global South, because we have seen on the map that a few African countries, a few Latin American countries also pursue feminist foreign policy, so maybe you could give us an example. And just because I can't help it, a personal remark, because I work in security and have seldom been in a room with 95% women, but as in any other security event that I have ever attended in my career, it's always a man who speaks first. So this just a note to organizers. This is an absolute disgrace. Thank you. With all due respect.
So the third is over here.
Good evening. My name is Mansour Ayubi. I'm from Afghanistan and a student at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, and also a member of SAGE, that is the Students Advocating Gender Equality at the Academy. And I'm also part of Afghanistan Solidarity Group. We are organizing separate homeschoolings in Afghanistan with a lot of support in Austria. I had one remark and two questions. The first remark, I don't know if I can agree.
Could you please stick to the questions?
I'll be very quick. The first remark would be that I just heard that since 1991, women were never weaponized in a conflict. I don't think that would be really accurate. And the first question is, if we look to these patriarchal state structures, we do see that the feminist perspective have brought a lot of insight into this, how to look to that all structures that's entirely for men and disadvantage women or totally ignore them. But when it comes to the practical policies, for instance, the He for She campaign from the UN Women, they have now a website, and there are 10 champions on this website listed. The people who are, the men who are standing for women, he is standing for she. If we look at that all campaigns, it seems that it's completely derailed and again ignorant to the woman's existence, even if we have like at least 100 years of very active activism of the woman equality rights. So the question is this state or the current structures, are they able or do they have the capacity to accommodate a feminist foreign policy perspective? And the second short question will be, from a very feminist foreign policy perspective, what can be done against the Taliban and their policies against women in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the questions. We will answer these three now. Just for the next round, I've only seen arms from here. So one is here, another one was over there. Okay, so we have these three questions. I think the Swedish question goes to you. What would be your reply?
Well, thank you. Well, it's very easy to answer to the Swedish man over there because it's not enough. That's as simple as that. I mean, half of the world's population are women, and they are totally and systematically underrepresented. They don't have the same rights. They don't have the same resources. And that is all over. It's structural and it's systematic. And that is what we have seen, that many men has not seen. And that's why we use the feminist foreign policy that is making real change for millions of women and girls. And that is what shows in the evaluation as well.
Mrs. Dienitz, please accept my apologies. I couldn't follow because I had to look at the auditorium. So I would pass the question to you, to both of you, or
I can. I mean, just to follow up on that, I don't think any feminist is ignoring CEDAW, or indeed a lot of the frameworks that exist regionally. I think it's feminists that advocated for CEDAW, but we know that feminism, at least, advocates for a different type of world. And a lot of the instruments that exist are there to engender the status quo, right? So there's a whole discourse, for example, in academia about making war safe for women. This has come about as a critique of the women, peace and security agenda, even when it has had some successes. So I think we do need to go beyond just instruments to really rethink what the status quo is. But to go to your question of success stories, I think it's difficult to pin down in the 54 countries. But one of the things that I perhaps admired about Sweden's Margot Wallström, who sort of declared feminist foreign policies, there was a time when she was in office where she took time out to go on what is called solidarity missions. And the African Union's Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security often does this, where she goes and she actually listens to what it is that women's rights organizations and feminists want in those countries that are actually going through conflict. What is their actual vision for peace? Not listening to the special women that are invited when some folks have already designed what the peace mission is. And one of the things I liked, sort of just tracking through that, is that it was around after that that the idea of the 3 R's started expanding a bit, to think more critically about what role something like intersectionality actually plays in the context of this rights, resources, and representation. So I think, a very important feminist principle of solidarity, it might seem ephemeral and inconsequential, but it very much matters, particularly if we're trying to reorient the relationship between the global north and the global south, and I think that one mattered.
Would you like to add?
On here and here as well. Pretty much adding to what Toni said, and also I guess I was a bit surprised by the use of language in the comment from Sweden, in a sense that feminists, as Toni just said, would never avoid CEDAW. It comes from feminists. And all our work, be it on ministry level, on academia, or my writing or my organization, it's strongly based on CEDAW. And there was no watering down. I mean, there's no reason for it. It's a proper feminist agenda. And at the same time, I guess I want to look at what has been said a bit more thoroughly and really take it apart from a conceptual level. So feminist foreign policy or feminist approach is a whole transformative idea, and within the idea, different tools and frameworks and ideally new ways of ensuring accountability are looked at to ensure in this whole new concept and storytelling and going about how we can achieve the goals that we are about to achieve. And CEDAW, which all feminist foreign policies, currently 16 globally officially, when we look at the documents, they all mention CEDAW, as Toni does in her work, and Anne does in her work, and I do in my book. So there is no watering down, avoiding. It's part of the puzzle, but as Anne also said, just not enough. On structures, and if in current structures feminist foreign policy is possible, I think you say it frequently that feminist foreign policy as such can really not exist if we're being realistic. So in a patriarchal world that we have, a feminist foreign policy coming from the radical idea does not exist because the structures are patriarchal. So I understand all the countries that have committed to a feminist foreign policy as a commitment. They try to do things better. And that is fantastic, because that is what we need in a world that does not function for most of its population. We need commitments to doing it better. And because you mentioned he for she, well, I personally find it patronizing, and I'm not a fan of it. I could never, and I think this judgment I come to when I do the role reverse very often. I could never imagine a global campaign, her for him. Oh my world, how patronizing would that be? Like, what man would stand next to a woman who would pat like a guy on his head, like, I'm for you, I'm with you. Like, that doesn't exist, so it's patronizing. And I guess it's as much as some who are trying to do good, and I appreciate the intention, brave enough to do in a world that is so patriarchal and really attacks those who are demanding more. So, I mean, we know from our work, we know the online violence we face, the online violence you face when you try to promote more radical ideas and more courageous ideas. That is the backlash you face. So I know why in a patriarchal world some would suggest something like he for she, but we really have to go further.
There also was the question about the Taliban. I'm afraid there is no easy answer, but could you briefly comment on this question?
Oh gosh. No, thank you so much for that question. You're precisely right. I don't have an answer. And I think in a way, for me as an academic, because I'm allowed to do that, one of the things I reflect on is the limits of something like feminist foreign policy within a state system, right? It is still the case that, not Germany, not the UK has governance over Afghanistan for now. And we know that, to an extent, my country has been complicit in where we find ourselves with respect to Afghanistan. But again, this is where something like the Women, Peace and Security agenda comes in. What is it that states, what are the commitments that states have made with respect to women, peace and security agenda? How can they continue to support women, women's groups, women's perspectives? How can they continue to put pressure on the Taliban to engage with why it is actually important to include half of your population? Because at the end of the day, that's what it fundamentally is. It does not make any rational sense to exclude half of your actual population. So I think the only way, and it seems like a cop-out, but at this point in time, is continued dialogue and the political willingness not to give up.
Thanks. But you always have a very difficult, when you are in the government, you always have the very, very difficult situation to say, if we support women in Afghanistan now, is it possible without actually supporting the Taliban? And that is very, very difficult, because it's when it's such an authoritarian, dictatorial situation as in Afghanistan, it's nearly impossible to reach, for example, women's groups without going in some way through the Taliban. In many countries it is possible, but in Afghanistan now we worked with this issue and discussed that issue a lot to see how is it possible. But it is very difficult. But I know also, maybe in the reception, I know VIDC is working with Afghanistan, and so you can also discuss that issue with them at the reception.
Thanks a lot. I would like to invite a second round. We have three questions. I only saw the arms, unfortunately. So one was over here. Please present yourself and a very brief question.
Thank you very much for the inspiring statements and discussion, and thank you very much for allowing also the question. Very shortly, I have very long worked in foreign affairs at the EU level, and Resolution 1325 is not precisely new. So I remember discussions how to put it in practice in peacekeeping missions. So I would rather like a kind of look at how it is applied now in reality. And I would like to ask Toni Haastrup, do you know any success story or any example on how African armies or peacekeeping missions within Africa do apply actually 1325, and what difference has it made so far, or does it make a difference? This is one question. Then I have a very short question to Minister Linde. You mentioned the very intriguing data from trade. So you said that there was 30% more tariffs on women's sportswear than on men's. Could you explain that a little bit? Because it sounds very confusing to me. Yeah.
Okay. Another question was here in the middle. Yeah, please go ahead.
I am working in the humanitarian field, and I put it like on DRC because you mentioned it, Congo, because we are kind of depending on them because they have a lot of natural resources on cobalt. So the German car industry for the e-mobility depends on them. So my question is, how do you explain the German car industry that they should not earn that much money, a little bit less to make it more humane, because there are a lot of human rights issues, and DRC is one of the poorest countries in the world. And then how do you keep this platform now of the feminist foreign policy in Germany? Are there strategies to keep it in place? So how can you at least change the patriarchal system as much that at least can stay as it is? So, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And another question was over there.
Yeah, my name is Tina Leisch. I'm a political activist. I have a question. I don't know if you agree, but maybe one of the most feminist organizations in Middle East is the organization of the Kurdish women and the Kurdish movement, who really implies wherever they are in the chiefs of the administration, they have this double leadership, one woman, one man. Wherever there are mayors of the cities, they imply woman houses, blah, 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 and they're really feminist. And we don't see any solidarity of the European foreign politics with them. We don't see European social democratic parties being sistered with them. We have now had a lawyer of one of these women in prison. I mean, I think there are several hundred peaceful activists and mayors and parliamentary women in prison in Turkey. And one question is, why does this idea of feminist foreign policy not apply to the Kurdish people? It's just there are always other
Thank
reasons.
you. There was another question before.
Yeah, and
there was someone pointing her head before you. So also in this direction, please go ahead. So we'll take another fourth question so that we have this round finished.
Thank you very much. Kristina Holzer, ordinary citizen. I would, as I understood many examples you said would, in my access, being a gender mainstream.
Could you hold it closer to your mouth?
Thank you, sorry. Many examples you brought were in my access, gender mainstreaming access. So I now learned that feminism includes this access, actually. And the main question would be, Mrs. Linde, in your active time as foreign minister, meeting your counterparts in Africa, Asia, did they even understand feminism foreign policy? Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for this second round. Maybe we start with the last one.
Yeah, I can take the three questions that was directed to me. One about the tariffs. What I mean is that when you do a trade agreement, you have tariffs on each product. And then you can, if you have the differences between men and women, for example, when men and women clothes, in sports or in other way, you can see what are the tariffs. And then you could see that it was 6 times higher on a woman's silk shirt than on a man's shirt. And on sports, it was 30% higher tariffs if it was a woman tank top than on a man tank top. and that's with no explanation other than it was for men or women. But you couldn't see that if you don't have disaggregated data. So that's why you need to do it. And then you have to say in the trade agreement, this is not acceptable. So that's why it's so important. Do you understand? Yeah. When it comes to Kurds, I totally don't understand what you're saying. We have working with the Kurds all the time. I've been in Diyarbakir I don't know how many times. We have been working together with them. I have negotiated with especially the women leaders of the Kurdish parties, both in northeast Syria and Turkey. There are also, of course, Kurds in Iraq that we work with a lot. I have been having a trade delegation to the Kurdish area in northern Iraq. So I'm very sorry, I just don't understand what you're talking about. We work with the Kurds a lot, all the time. And then when it comes to the third question was...
did they really understand in the heads of states what you're talking about?
Many don't. And they use have you heard about the male dominant techniques? There are 5 male dominant techniques that the Nordic professor Berit Aas was delivering. I often talk about this in women's group, and it's kind of how you are using technique to dominate women so that the women's perspective doesn't come. One is to belittling them, to withhold information, to put on shame, and those issues. And I can take one example when I was negotiating with Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, which I have done several times, and it was like 3 hours negotiation and 1.5 hour press conference and then 3 hour lunch, so it goes on forever, and you really need to be very knowledgeable about what you are dealing with when you negotiate with a typical male like Lavrov. And still he uses male dominance techniques. So when we were discussing the Minsk agreement, which we did several times, where we're trying to get Ukraine and Russia to agree to an agreement that Germany and France has. He said like this: "Dear Anne, I cannot continue to talk with you if you don't know what you are talking about." And that was, of course, to pat me on the head and to make me insecure. Did I not know what I was talking about? Of course I know what I was talking about. But I knew it, and I could see it, and I saw what he was doing. So I told him, "Dear Sergei, I very much know what I'm talking about. I just don't think like you."
Lavrov is ein harter Knochen, as we say in German. That's a nut hard to crack. So there was a question if you have success stories from African peacekeeping troops in Africa.
I think there's sort of 2 parts to that question. One is, what's the EU doing with 1325, and what is actually happening in African troops. So one potential success, for example, is the fact that through evaluating AMISOM, which for a very long time was supported by the European Union, the African Union came up with a zero tolerance policy, for example, which has become a model for thinking about the abuses, sexual exploitation that happens perpetrated by peacekeepers, where it's very difficult to know how you discipline them, because on the one hand they are representing particular states, but they are working for the UN or whatever. So you got this policy, and it was something that was really monitored in the context of AMISOM. The extent to which the policy has spread and is actually being actualized, I think, is a totally different story. With respect to the EU and 1325, you're right, in 2008 we had this comprehensive approach to 1325 and 1820, and it did nothing for 10 years. Nothing. It was just documents that talked about having gender focal points and gender advisors, but I did not really see a material difference, because what you tended to have was
folks who are about to be deployed will go into weapons training and they'll say, well, gender issues are not really relevant when we're talking about ammunition, so we'll just wait for the human rights training. And the human rights training, people roll their eyes and like, of course we already know this because, you know, we're from this perfect country, so what is it that you have to tell us? But I think a lot of things change around 2016, 2017, when the EU started to work, the External Action Service started to work towards a strategic approach. And you got the strategic approach in 2018, and then the action plan in 2019. But this also comes at a time when the EU is willing to engage with gender more broadly. So you've got the Gender Action Plan 3. And we see the entrance of something like intersectionality, really thinking about, you know, what are the power dynamics between those who are deployed and the communities within which they're deployed to? What is the content of gender training beyond pay attention to women, pay attention to women's needs? And I think that, as with anything, that process takes a while because it kind of always depends on who is donating personnel. But I would say, at least in the context of my research, that we've begun to see a shift around 2018 with a strategic approach, and I think it's only now that we're evaluating concretely what impact is it actually playing in those communities that have EU personnel deployed to, but also just engagement with Africa more broadly. What's that?
Then we had the question, I think it was directed to you, Mrs. Lunz. How can you in Germany continue with this value-based feminist foreign policy if you have the interests in the DRC concerning cobalt and other natural resources?
As I'm not part of the government, but pretty much from the other side, from civil society, who has been pushing the German government to implement a feminist foreign policy and has advised them on doing so. Like from a civil society perspective, our interest in the way we work in general, for example, as the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, is by highlighting such human rights violations, which you, for example, have mentioned, and then demanding that those in power find some proper solutions. And so at the Center, for example, we're currently implementing a project on supply chains. So really look at, with what you mentioned, you're touching on this a little bit, the supply chains, and we talked about that before as well when we talked about trade. So from a feminist perspective on trade policy, for example, we have to focus on supply chains. Who's producing, who's being exploited, who's not earning enough for the money, who is making the money in the whole value chain. And a feminist approach would demand everything that the exploitation stops and that the current international capitalist system that we have does not continue to favor those that already have money and wealth and continues to exploit those that do not have it yet. So from my perspective, not being government, it is, all I can say is that we would continue to highlight those human rights violations. And in Germany, for example, we now have a Lieferkettengesetz. And whilst we were not engaged in the advocacy towards that, it very much comes also from civil society. So that is the role that I perceive, that whilst a government implements or tries to implement something hopefully transformative, such as a feminist foreign policy, that we continue to check how it's being done, if it's pinkwashing or not, what they're doing, and really put kind of the finger into the wound.
Thanks a lot. When I look into the auditorium, I notice that there are still a lot of questions that you want to ask. There is the opportunity to approach our experts at the reception in a few minutes. Thanks a lot for coming to Vienna. Thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought and for talk. And we hope that your ideas will be transmitted through people in the auditorium to the discussions.
Can I ask a question to you now, since you've been asking us all the time?
Very briefly.
Very brief. So who here or who in Austria is now who's pushing for that? Who's making sure that what we worked on here together today, that this is being translated into pushing the government to adopt a feminist foreign policy? Who are the players here?
this is something, so I would have a not, well, this is something that you can discuss with the relevant politician sitting in the first row and at the reception. Again, I think we will manage somehow to get the ideas to the decision makers. If you want to hear more about feminist foreign policy, there is a podcast from the Vienna Institute for Dialogue and Cooperation called Blickwechsel, and the current episode is devoted to feminist foreign policy. So if you want to hear more, please tune in. You can find it anywhere where you can find podcasts. Thanks a lot to the Parliament, thanks a lot to the organizers, thanks a lot to VIDC for having this discussion. I think it was very valuable, very reasonable to have it right now. Thanks to you, to all of you for coming, for listening, to maybe changing your point of view or enriching your knowledge about feminist foreign policy. I think we all can do with a little bit more of it. Thanks for coming.